Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to our webinar on eco-modulation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Junaid Francis, and I'm the Stakeholder Relations Manager at Petco. We are pleased that you have made the time to join us today. In leading producer responsibility, our broader purpose at Petco is to contribute to the sustainability of our environment, facilitating people to live better lives and to thrive. So today gives me great pleasure to welcome more than 130 attendees. That's how much we have registered for this webinar. To the webinar from across a broad range of audiences, including PROs in the paper and packaging, as well as electronic sectors, government representatives from both national departments and municipalities, NGOs, Petco members and representatives from the broader industry, as well as stakeholders from the collection and recycling value chain, such as our buyback center and recycler partners. The objective of this webinar is to raise awareness about eco-modulation, its principles, implementation strategies, and its impact on the recycling and waste management sector. The session aims to provide insights from industry experts, share international best practices, and foster discussion on the challenges and opportunities in implementing eco-modulation within the South African context and our regulatory and competitive landscape. Before we jump in, I've got to do the housekeeping and get that out of the way. As you will see, your mics are muted, so please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A section. If we don't get to all the questions during the session, we will be sure to follow up and respond afterward. Please only use the chat for greeting and keep all the questions and the discussions related to the content in the Q&A section. Lastly, we know that 80% of virtual meeting attendees regard flawless audio as a key requirement for holding successful meetings. While we have tested everything to ensure that we have smooth transitions, gremlins are known to creep in from time to time, and we ask for your patience and grace should any of this happen. But touch wood, we won't get any of that today. I'd also like to tick our compliance box by reminding us all about the need to be compliant with the Competition Act. Thanks to Green Cape for sharing their simplified competition statement with us, which is on the screen now. So a quick reminder that this is a pre-competitive space and we are here to work towards addressing shared challenges in a non-competitive way. The competition law prohibits any collusion or restrictions that prevent competition. There are competitors on this call, so please do not share any sensitive information. Let's be vigilant and ensure that we abide by all the competition rules. If anything is raised that you are concerned about, feel free to raise your concern in the chat. The session is recorded and a link as well as the presentations will be made available shortly afterwards. And now onto the agenda for the day. Following me will be my colleague Boipelo Madonsela, Petco's recycling value chain analyst, who will be setting the scene, after which Petco CEO Cherise Schaltz will be sharing perspectives on the considerations for the applications of eco-modulation in South Africa. We will then have our international expert, Kyriakos Papounos, who will share some reflections on the implementation of eco-modulation from across the globe. A panel discussion will then follow, and we will leave some time at the end for questions and answers from the audience. With that, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Boipelo for the setting of the scene. Over to you, Boipelo.
Right, so I think first some background about Petco. Petco is a producer responsibility organization incorporated in 2004. Petco administers extended producer responsibility schemes on behalf of its members for various identified products in the packaging sector. Our mission is to take accountability for our producer members' products throughout the entire life cycle, as mandated by Section 18 of the National Environmental Management Waste Act. Petco serves as a national organization, facilitating and supporting the collection and recycling value chain, guiding packaging design, stimulating end-use markets for recycled material, and conducting various communication and awareness initiatives. Petco's efforts have led to annual growth in South Africa's collection and recycling rates, diverting packaging from landfill and promoting circular economy. Petco administers EPR schemes for PET bottles and jars, as well as their associated closures and labels. We also have a scheme for liquid board packaging and minor volumes of thermoforms and PET strapping in a closed loop scheme on request of our members. Our role as a PRO is to turn a successful and sustainable EPR scheme that keeps the value chain in balance. This requires a successful juggling of the three balls of collection, recycling capacity, and end-use demand. Unlocking collection is, of course, a necessity to ensure that waste is diverted away from landfills and the environment, as well as enters the recycling value chain successfully. Once waste enters the recycling value chain, we need adequate capacity to recycle. Without adequate recycling capacity, even waste that has been collected will eventually make its way back to landfill. Although less desirable and not advocated by PETCO, waste exports and waste to energy would be more preferable than landfill. Lastly, growing end-use market demand for recycled content provides an economic stimulus throughout the value chain. Although local circularity is preferred, exports of recycled material can be necessary in some instances. To achieve our mandate on behalf of our member companies and to cultivate valuable partnerships with key stakeholders across the value chain, our work at PETCO is guided by a set of 5 values, being respect. So respect between the company and our partners, between our staff and members, and between members themselves. Empowerment. We seek every opportunity to create work, entrepreneurship opportunities, and hope for previously disadvantaged people, including women, for whom the recovery of waste for recycling may be a lifeline. Third is integrity. To carry out all activities with honesty, sincerity, care, and reliability. Professionalism, which means maintaining high standards and providing services in an efficient manner. And lastly, sustainability, subscribing to triple bottom line business principles by implementing business practices that are environmentally and socially sustainable. In South Africa, the waste management landscape continues to evolve rapidly, driven by mandatory EPR. One of the pressing issues is our landfill crisis. With sites nearing capacity across the country, there is an urgent need for design for circularity and to keep valuable packaging out of landfills. There's an important need to increase the separation of recyclable packaging at source to maintain its value. In addition to this, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment is conducting audits to ensure compliance, reduce the number of free riders, while pushing businesses to meet collection, recycling, and recycled content targets. At the same time, we're seeing encouraging growth in bottle-to-bottle recycling capacity, with players like Extra Pet and Alpla boosting infrastructure to recycle PET bottles into food-grade material. These advancements are crucial. However, it is imperative to note that a key aspect to building and maintaining sustainable collection and recycling value chains is packaging design. Therefore, to maximize the recycling of packaging, it is essential that retailers, brand owners, packaging manufacturers, and designers embed recyclability principles into their pack design processes, so that at the end of its life, the packaging material can be successfully recycled and used again in new products and packaging. So twice a year, PETCO's collection and recycling value chain team conduct bale characterization studies. This is to understand the ratios of PETCO-identified products in a typical PET bale that lands up at our recyclers. These studies have been instrumental in helping us identify poorly designed PET packaging that hampers the sustainability of the recycling value chain. And this is coupled with constant feedback from our PET recycling partners on poorly designed packaging that is difficult to recycle. Some of the biggest design challenges are brightly colored bottles that have no end-use markets, PET bottles with metal closures that have to be manually removed before the bottle can be recycled, and that's seen in the image on the far left. In the middle, we see PET or PVC shrink sleeves on PET bottles and jars that have to be manually removed. And the far right image shows opaque or white colored PET bottles, particularly from the dairy sector for products such as amasi and macheo that cannot be recycled. We also see PET lookalikes that are collected with PET bottles and jars and contaminate the PET waste stream if they are not sorted out of bales prior to processing. So these include PVC honey and PVC foam bath bottles. The first image on the far left is from a PET recycling facility where PVC honey bottles were being manually sorted out of bales. The second image is from a bale characterization study we conducted. And the third image is also from one of our recycling partners. These are compostable or biodegradable bottles. There seems to be an influx of these bottles in the hospitality sector, and particularly in hotel chains in Cape Town. These are being sold as an environmental alternative to PET, but of course, without the infrastructure for the bottles to be collected and composted, and without it being clearly labeled as non-recyclable, they continue to be problematic for PET recyclers. So what is the true cost of poor packaging design? Increased recycling costs associated with additional labor costs for manually sorting non-recyclable packaging, transporting the packaging and also disposing of the material, legal compliance. Brand owners who place non-recyclable packaging on the market are unable to meet legislated collection and recycling targets as their packaging ends up at landfill, exacerbating the national challenge of limited landfill capacity. Non-recyclable packaging with no value will not be collected and may end up in the environment, causing environmental degradation and also contamination of recycling waste streams. In addition to this, non-recyclable packaging can cause damage to recycling infrastructure, resulting in recyclers losing production time and having to prematurely replace or repair equipment. Varied material pricing as well. Material with lower end-use market value is purchased by recyclers at a lower price. This impacts livelihoods of those who operate in the collection value chain. A clear example of this is the varied price of green, amber, and clear PET bottles. And lastly, availability of recycled content. The market for recycled material is dependent on confidence in the technical integrity of the recycled material. So to achieve good quality recycled material, it is imperative that the feedstock is also of good quality. As shown earlier, without a demand for recycled material, there is reduced economic stimulus throughout the value chain, which could result in a collapse of the value chain. And ultimately, producers will not be able to meet their collection, recycling, and recycled content targets. I would now like to hand over to Cherise Goltz, who will expand on eco-modulation, an approach intended to encourage the design of packaging that is easier to recycle, reduces environmental impact, and enables PROs to charge the true cost of collection and recycling of packaging that is placed on the market by its members. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And thanks, Boipelo and Junaid, for the introduction. I'm going to be very quick and just talk a little bit about the background theory on eco-modulation and considerations for us in South Africa, where we are at this stage in our EPR journey. So our approach essentially at PETCO, as you've heard from Boipelo, is based on the understanding that for collection and recycling to flourish, one must create a value chain for the materials you're collecting, particularly in the case of systems led by informal collection in South Africa and other developing countries. As such, our efforts have been focused on balancing those three elements of collection, capacity, as well as capability, and then, of course, the end-use demand. And although there is often a demand for recycled material, this doesn't necessarily mean that collecting and recycling is a sustainable commercial activity. Although it might not be impossible, in general, in order to achieve sustainable or even publicly acceptable levels of recycling, some end-of-life support is necessary. In other words, the recycling value chain seldom is self-funding. Where gaps exist, EPR seeks to find ways to close them or to eliminate them. And if you look, the street value sets a minimum value below which material is simply not collected. The incremental value must cover more than the recycling chain to result in sustainable recycling. Essentially, there's a market value that the market is willing to pay for processed material. And this is a price that a recycler would need to achieve in the market without any support. Where this gap exists is one of the areas that EPR has to fill. So with EPR correctly applied, you start to consider the full cost, including the EPR of each material choice. This means that greener choices would also be more commercially sound, like the bar on the left, and producers should stop using materials that are hard to recycle and therefore carry a higher EPR fee, like the bar on the right. This is the essence of eco-modulation. So EPR is about funding the gap between what it costs to collect, sort, and recycle waste, and the revenue generated from selling the recyclable material. The role of eco-modulation is to close this gap by encouraging the design of more recyclable packaging. So if we read the definition, eco-modulation seeks to regulate the financial contribution made by companies to these systems based on the impact that their packaging has on the sorting and recycling process, and to promote circularity by incorporating recycled material. It's clearly stated in Section 18 of the National Environmental Management Waste Act that the EPR fee in South Africa must take into account the net cost of recovery, including a differentiated rate per item category of each product or class of product based on factors like ease of recovery and costs of establishing systems for the identified products. In support of determining differentiated EPR fees, DEFI published an EPR fee setting guideline in August last year. This document contained three approaches to fee setting, namely a flat fee approach, a modulated approach, and an eco-modulated approach. For eco-modulation, of course, the use of environmentally sustainable materials is rewarded, while the use of materials that are harmful is penalized. Higher fees are charged on materials that are difficult to recycle. So the complex South African context raises some questions. Here we have multiple producer responsibility organizations who adopt differing models, one of which relates to where the obligation of EPR should lie and where the fee is levied. There is some ambiguity in the regulations to perpetuate these. Can eco-modulation be applied at a raw material stage? When multiple PROs manage the same material stream, differing fee structures can create competition. While lower fees may drive cost reductions, this risks PRO shopping, where producers choose the cheapest option rather than the most effective. This undermines recycling targets, as packaging might not be designed for recyclability and the recycling rates may stagnate. Effective competition among PROs should prioritize transparency and eco-modulation to encourage producers to invest in better product design, ultimately fostering innovation and ensuring the recycling system's efficiency and effectiveness. Competition is important, but we also believe that it is important for some sort of harmonization or accreditation guidelines in order to prevent an uneven playing field and to limit unintended consequences. So putting forward for discussion later would be considerations to take into account in a competitive environment. Eco-modulation should not be a competitive differentiating factor. Eco-modulation criteria should be equal to all PROs and of the same absolute value. Focus on malice has the advantage of not jeopardizing the financial balance of the PRO. Applying eco-modulation criteria should be based on reliable and auditable information. We need good data. So on that background setting, thanks for listening, and I will hand you back to Junaid.
Cool. Thank you, Shani. I will now hand over to Kyriakos Papounis, our guest speaker for the day. Kyriakos has extensive experience in top management positions in the construction and waste management industries. In 2005, Kyriakos was chosen by industry in Cyprus to develop the collective EPR scheme for packaging there. He designed the PRO Green Dot Cyprus, which was accredited in 2006. During 2007 and 2008, he and his team developed an EPR organization for waste management of electrical and electronic equipment and a battery EPR organization, which was also accredited. Kyriakos managed the three systems as their general manager until 2017 when he left to found and direct Papounis Sustainability Consultants. On that note, over to you, Kyriakos.
Thank you, Junaid, and thank you all for joining, and thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure to discuss about the evolution in South Africa. I've been doing some work in the past with PETCO and the Alliance, so I know a few things. I know the regulation, and I know that some of the challenges on the ground. And of course, talking about eco-modulation is usually a challenge that comes later in the maturity of the PROs once the market is the PRO market is well established. But I know that is also part of your regulation, and it's something that is has to develop and is challenging, especially because of the structure of the ecosystem of EPR for packaging in South Africa. I will talk about some of the experiences internationally, although they are also limited, because even in the European Union, where we have a long history with EPR, more than 30 years, it became an obligation for the PROs recently in the EU legislation, and it's actually practiced in a few countries, not in all the European countries. So we'll go through some of these examples and some of the challenges. Next slide. Let's move on. We'll cover it through the presentation, so we don't have to go. Yeah, if we talk about the main incentives of EPR in its let's say main scope, besides the collection of fees by the producers for the management of waste, which will increase recycling rates and decrease the material going to landfill, one of the main incentives has always been the improvement of the design of products, the provision of incentives for eco-design to push the design of better products in the market. Next slide. So if we try to map the main responsibilities of EPR, we definitely have if you see the scheme on the right part of the slide, we have the green part, which is actually funding and organizing, in most of the cases, collection, recycling, and reusing of packaging. We also have an obligation to educate the consumers for the sorting at source, to make them part of the equation, which is very significant, especially as we move into higher recycling targets and the need to collect packaging in an organized way, not only through waste pickers, but in an organized collection where people sort the waste at source. And as we said earlier on the blue part of the diagram, we also have an obligation for the product design, for the improvement of the products that we put on the market. And that is not only for packaging, these are obligations for all the EPR for the different waste streams as well. Next one. In reality, though, if we see over the years, more than 30 years of experience of EPR in Europe and in other places of the world as well, EPR has been more successful on the downstream part. If we look at this diagram produced by UNEP, if we look at the whole life cycle of the materials towards product use and end of life management, we have the upstream, which is the extraction of raw materials. We have the production of products, which is the blue, and then we have the end of life management of the products, which is the green. So EPR has been more successful over the years in the green part, in managing the waste at the end of its life, and it has been less effective in motivating the improved design, the reusability, the recyclability. This is mostly a result of the EPR fees being a very small part of the cost of the product, especially in some types of products, a very minimum, a very marginal cost, which did not provide enough incentive to improve also design. That is why, by realizing that, the EU decided to regulate as well an obligation to eco-modulate the fees for the PROs for the different waste streams lately. Next one. So what is eco-modularity? I think it's clear from the definition. The goal is to incentivize sustainable packaging, design and production by rewarding eco-friendly practices, recyclable materials, incorporate recycled content, or designing packaging that is easy to recycle. And on the other hand, to make it more expensive to put on the market products that are difficult to recycle, they contain hazardous substances, or they generate significant environmental impact. So it's basically using financial incentives to separate the more eco-friendly products and materials from the less eco-friendly products. Next slide. So if we look at the legislation in the EU, we have around eco-modularity and circularity, as it has evolved in the last few years after 2018, where we had the circular economy package introduced. In the Waste Framework Directive, where is the main legislation that focuses on the EPR obligation, it mandates EPR, first of all, for different waste streams. In the EU, is mandatory for all the member states for packaging, electrical and electronic waste, cars and batteries. And of course, eventually now on fabrics, single-use plastics and other. But also at member state, we have a lot of other applications in other waste streams of EPR with national legislation. But in the EU legislation, we have these 4 basic waste streams that are under mandatory EPR. In the latest revision of the Waste Framework Directive, in Article 8.8, became also an obligation to modulate based on the environmental performance of products. So fees should be modulated based on the environmental characteristics. It's also an obligation to be transparent to the industry and to the consumer. How are eco-modulated fees structured? How do you transfer, let's say, cost from one material to the other based on environmental characteristics? And of course, that eco-modulation and eco-design principles should be promoted through eco-modulation as well in the course of better circularity of materials and circular economy objectives. Next one. Now, there are some key issues with eco-modulation. First of all, the mechanisms for implementing eco-modulation. We need to define the criteria to use for the adjustment of the fees. For example, recyclability, hazardous substances, recycled content. So we need to define how do we decide and how do we allocate the cost between material based on these characteristics as well. Some examples of eco-modulation factors is product design, material choice, recyclability, repairability, recycled content. So we need to define those. Now, some of the benefits of eco-modulating the fees, first of all, it encourages sustainable product design. It better encourages sustainable product design by these differentiated fees. It's reducing waste and environmental impact. If we manage to introduce better products, we reduce the impacts. And of course, at the same time, we promote circularity and circular economy principles. There are, of course, challenges and considerations in the implementation. We need to balance incentives and fairness to producers. And Sherry was also mentioning earlier some of the competition issues that we have with eco-modulation, especially when we have multiple PROs. I will touch upon that later. The monitoring and enforcement of eco-modulated fees. How do we monitor, especially at state level, how fees are eco-modulated, especially in a fragmented EPR ecosystem? You saw in the EU legislation, there is an obligation to be transparent of how you eco-modulate the fees, not use eco-modulation as an excuse to become competitive, to create a competitive advantage, especially in competing in markets with competing PROs. And of course, adapting the system to different industries with their own characteristics. Next one. Now, if we go to the basic way we calculate fees, going back to how do we calculate fees and how do we eco-modulate, the basic idea is that we are using, in general, a cost-based formula, which means that we calculate the cost for each material minus the value when we sell the material, divided by the quantity of the material put on the market to derive the EPR fees. This is what we call a cost-based formula. Of course, this is for organized collection. If you look at the formula, it's basically adding the collection cost, the sorting cost, and subtracting the value of the material. In the case of informal sector, waste pickers that are giving material to the recyclers and getting, for example, recycling notes or certificates from recyclers, which I know that is a significant part of what is happening in South Africa. So when the collection is informal, the numerator of this equation is usually a net cost because you buy a recycling certificate. So there was a collection cost, there was a sorting cost, minus the value of the material, and you get the residual, which is a net cost, and you divide by the material put on the market. This is the basic way of calculating EPR fees in most of the PROs. Next one. And I will not get into details, but basically, with in a structured way of calculating fees, you will have a spreadsheet where you have all the lines with the different costs: collection, sorting, sale of material, plus and minus, material coming from organized collection, possibly material coming from the informal sector, from the household projects, from commercial industrial projects. So you get all your costs, pluses and minuses, and divide by the value, the amount of material put on the market, so that you can actually derive the fee per material. Here you see just an example for glass with the different parameter beams, communication, informal sector, and so on and so forth. You put everything together so that you have a cost for the material and divide it by the amount of material put on the market to derive the fees. Next one. And of course, in structuring the fees, we have different approaches. We have the very basic approaches, and usually they were used at the beginning of EPR, at the first phases of EPR, where the fees are very grouped by the main materials, so glass, paper, steel, aluminum, plastic, other, and so on. And of course, eventually we are moving to more granulated fees, which might have also a small element of eco-modulation to start with, like the table on the left part of the slide, where you see that besides the basic material, plastic is also divided by chemistries, because we know very well that the different chemistries have different values and different characteristics. So we calculate also fees by plastic chemistry, and we have separate fees for those materials. And what you see with the red there, the other, is what I say a basic type of eco-modulation. In that other category, we have all the materials that are usually difficult to recycle, problematic, very small quantities to make any sense to sort them and so on. We group them all there, and we price them accordingly to create a fee for those materials. And usually you will see in some of the examples that in most of the cases, this other category is artificially priced to be more expensive than the rest of the categories, so that it gives also an incentive to shift away from these materials. So this is a very basic type of eco-modulation that we see in most of the PROs, even before there was any obligation to eco-modulate the fees. Next slide. Yes, here I'm showing examples from fees from different countries. It's not good to compare between countries unless you know the context. So it's not about comparing pricing between countries, but it's about showing some of the characteristics in the fees of established PROs in different countries. You see, for example, this first red box where there is almost always some price fixing between the materials. For example, you see that for PET and high-density polyethylene, although they are separate in categories, many countries have fixed the fee between the two by decision of the industry. They have fixed the fees, so they are not different between the two materials. So there is already some fixing of the fees one way or the other, and it almost happens in all the countries. The other thing I wanted to show is that this other category that we have in most of the countries in the EPR fees, and you see that this other category is almost in all the PROs more expensive than the rest of the material. So it's problematic, it's difficult material that are not sorted at the sorting station. They are grouped in that category, and they are artificially priced to be expensive to give an incentive to improve the packaging. So that's a basic eco-modulation that we have in traditional PROs, even before any obligation to eco-modulate the fees. Next one. So how do we implement this very basic eco-modularity? Of course, we know that there is material that are difficult to recycle or non-recyclable, or they are in very small quantities to make any sense to sort them at the sorting station. All these material are reported in one category, this other category. Now, if we price, as I showed earlier, the different costs for this material, we can have the collection cost. We can allocate or not allocate the sorting cost because we don't sort them in reality. We just leave them in the residual. And if we actually use the cost-based formula, because we don't have sorting cost for these materials, they would actually be cheaper than the other materials. So we have the difficult material with the cost-based formula to be cheaper than the easy material that we recycle and we sort, recycle, and sell for recycling. So to avoid having this material, this type of materials with a lower fee, we shift costs from the other materials to this other category so that it becomes more expensive. So we eco-modulate at a very basic level this other difficult category with higher fees than the other material. Next one. So let's see how do we eco-modulate in different countries now where eco-modulation is more advanced from this, let's say, basic eco-modulation that we see in most of the PROs. Next one. So, for example, you can see here in France where former Eco-emballage, which became Citeo, is eco-modulating for the last few years. You see, for example, level 1 eco-modulation, where basically there are differentiated fees between transparent PET bottles and HDPE bottles. There is an average higher fee for colored PET and PP and trays, and there is a higher EPR fee for PVC bottles, multi-layered plastics, flexibles, mixed plastic waste. So the more difficult it gets to recycle the material and the lower the value of the materials, the higher the fees for those more difficult materials. And at the second level, there is also a bonus and a malus system in France where those bonuses give further incentives to improve packaging. So if you switch from multi-layer to mono-layer tray and PET, you have an incentive in the fees, you have lower fees. If we integrate minimum percentage of recycled content, there is a bonus that lowers your fees. If this reusable and refillable packaging, there is again a bonus. If there is messaging on the packaging about sorting, you heard earlier the complication in sorting compostable or other types of packaging from traditional plastic. If you label your packaging properly, which will help also sorting, you have an incentive in the fees. On the other hand, you have a penalty if you use PVC, aluminum, and silicone elements in PET bottles. So if you make PET bottles difficult to recycle because you have sleeves or caps and stuff that come from other material. If you have opaque PET bottles with high mineral content, if you use PVC bottles, any other non-energy recoverable or recyclable packaging, you get a penalty. And an example in the bottom for the improvement of a bottle that was switched from 29 grams to 27 grams, so lightweighting of packaging. The difference is 7% in the reduction of the weight. So by definition, the producer will pay less because of lower weight. But there's an additional 8% bonus on the fees, so discount on the fees, because it has been working to improve its packaging. So one approach of implementing. Next one. Here, some other examples from other countries. In Italy, you pay 263 euros per ton for sortable and recyclable packaging. You pay 369 for packaging that is not sortable and recyclable with current technologies. In Portugal, to discourage the use of packaging that disrupts the recycling process, such as PET bottle with metal caps or PVC labels, there is a penalty of 10% on the fee. In Sweden, the fee modulation is based on the material, its sorting and processing properties, and saleability after sorting and processing. There is a higher fee, 360 per ton, and a lower fee, 261 per ton, to separate between those characteristics, the packaging with those characteristics. And in Spain, you see for PET, the price 433, HDP 377, and flexibles, which are much more difficult to recycle, to collect and recycle, 739 euros per ton. So there are deviations in the prices. Next one. So in France, basically we have the bonus and maluses to give incentives and disincentives. We incentivize eco-friendly materials that are easy to recycle and the recyclable content, and that has an impact on producers and waste management services. Next one. In Germany, the Packaging Act provides for fee structure based on recyclability and material types. The idea is to encourage sustainable packaging design, and the results should be seen in packaging waste reduction as well. Next one. In Sweden, EPR for electronic modulation, it should be differentiated fees for electronics based on disassembly and repairs. And in the EU, there are now specific obligations for repairability and reusability and manuals for disassembly and so on. The fee should promote longer product life cycles, and of course that will have outcomes for the electronic markets and the sustainability of these products. Next one. In Japan, there is a home appliance recycling law, and the fees for manufacturers should be based on appliance recyclability. There are incentives for designing, easily dismantling and recycling, for easily dismantled and recycled products. And that is expected also to have effects on consumer electronics and the recycling rates because of the improved characteristics. Next one. In Canada, there are the different product stewardships program, as they call it, which are EPR programs. There are examples from British Columbia and Ontario. There is fee modulation for packaging and printed paper programs. And of course, the idea is that eco-modulation should be driving local sustainability efforts further. Next one. Okay, some of the challenges for eco-modulation in countries with multiple PROs. Next slide. Sherry was also mentioning some of these problems already, but we see them in Europe as well, because we have many countries with multiple PROs in parallel to countries with single PROs. And if we look at the examples that we have in detailed eco-modulation. We have such eco-modulation in France with a single PRO, in Belgium with a single PRO, and of course, much less in the countries, or not at all in countries with multiple PROs, besides this very basic eco-modulation with the other category. So eco-modulation links EPR fees to the environmental impacts of packaging. So you need to transfer, in reality, costs and fees from one product to the other to eco-modulate the fees. Now, in countries with multiple PROs, implementing eco-modulation is much more challenging because there are the different fee structures between PROs could create an uneven playing field. The monitoring of compliance is also much more challenging. And since companies can shop between PROs, they can actually cherry pick, as Sherif was saying, and buy compliance at the lowest price for the different materials from different PROs that are trying to eco-modulate their fees. So the question is, how do you stop producers from cherry picking and shipping around for the products with the lowest EPR fees? This is a significant challenge when you have competition. Next one. Different packaging types may require tailored eco-modulation approaches. Uniform criteria may not suit all the product categories. Multi-PRO systems can increase also administrative burdens. And of course, eco-modulation can impact competition among PROs. So while you're trying to decide how to deal with eco-modulation, you still have to care, and you definitely have to make sure that you're not losing your competitive advantage. So there is a trade-off between eco-modulation and your competitive stand in the market. How do you transfer costs and fees from one product to another while keeping your competitiveness? It's not like Belgium or France, where you have a single PRO. They decide how to eco-modulate the fees. They can be transparent. In a competitive market, this is much more difficult to do. Next one. So how to do it, how to address complication and harmonize across competing PROs. Some ideas. Consistency criteria and fee structure is essential to ensure fairness. Regulatory frameworks can help standardize eco-modulation criteria and set minimum standards to avoid race to the bottom. So you need to create a field, a structured field, and structured criteria for the PROs, competing PROs to use. Overarching principles can guide eco-modulation across diverse materials. Methods for calculating eco-modulated fees must be clear and standardized. So you need to do work with the PROs, give them the tools to do it, and make sure that they use the same tools. Common guidelines for eco-modulation can ensure consistency across PROs. Transparent calculation helps align practices and signals environmental impacts. And regulators need to establish an oversight mechanism to ensure adherence to eco-modulation. So you cannot expect that to happen in an open market where the PROs are competing without coordination between them. In this case, the presence of a clearinghouse in a market becomes even more essential. In the EU, it's an obligation already to have a clearinghouse if you have multiple PROs. So in order to eco-modulate, the role of the clearinghouse becomes much more important to create all those guidelines and monitor the application of those guidelines for eco-modulation between competing PROs. Next one. Now, as a conclusion for this case, with multiple competing packaging PROs, eco-modulation is feasible in countries with multiple PROs, but it's more challenging. You need to, and especially the authorities need to do more to make sure that the PROs can actually eco-modulate their fees in such a market. Harmonization, transparency, and oversight are key for successful implementation, and that's where the clearinghouse has a very significant role. And of course, a coordinated approach can help achieve intended environmental benefits. So you need to do more effort, you need to do homework, and the state needs to support this evolution in countries with competing PROs. Next one. Now we shift to the discussion on more closer to the case of South Africa, where you don't only have multiple PROs, but you have material PROs. You have PROs that work for a specific material only, which is even more challenging. Next slide. So things become more complicated with material PROs. You can do some eco-modulation with materials that are within the same PRO. For example, if you cover different chemistries of plastics, you can eco-modulate between the different chemistries that you cover in your PRO. But if you're covering only metals or only paper, it becomes even more difficult because it's impossible or next to impossible to agree between you to transfer cost and fees from one material to the other, because that would mean transferring cost from one PRO to the other. How can you eco-modulate if you cannot agree between you to transfer cost to each other? And I understand that this is very difficult in a competitive market. A potential solution could be the PRO alliance that is already in the market to become a PRO superstructure that can set the rule for such transfers, which could eventually lead to what we have, for example, in Italy over the years, where CONAI, that superstructure on top of material companies, as they used to call the material PROs, it's actually today setting the fees. So eco-modulation is done at CONAI level and not at the material PRO or the material companies level. However, a clearinghouse at ministry level or between ministry and industry will still be needed. I think that the clearinghouse will become inevitable in this case if you want to actually eco-modulate the fees under the existing ecosystem structure. Next. And I was also asked to touch upon a bit on activity-based costing versus material costing, although in reality, when we're costing with mature PROs, we are mixing, at the end of the day, activity-based costing and material costing. But activity-based costing is the idea that you calculate the cost per type of operation. So you're calculating the cost based on collection cost, sorting cost. Each activity is analyzed to determine the resources consumed, cost, and then assigned proportionately based on the intensity of these activities. It provides a more accurate reflection of the actual cost associated with managing different types of packaging waste, because it considers the variability in how different materials are processed. And for example, materials that require more complex sorting or have higher contamination rates would incur higher costs, as the activities associated with their management are more expensive and resource intensive. Next slide. On the other hand, with material differentiation costing, which is getting closer now to eco-modulation, material differentiation costing assigns cost based primarily on the type of material rather than the activities involved. In this approach, fees are differentiated based on the material characteristics such as recyclability, environmental impact, or the presence of hazardous substances. Costs are allocated to producers based on the material's potential impact on the waste management system, incentivizing in this way the use of more recyclable and environmentally friendly materials. It is a simpler method to implement compared to activity-based costing, as it focuses on categorizing material rather than the detailed breakdown of activities. Next slide. In reality, as I said, we are using a mix where the cost-based formula is activity-based costing, but when you transfer the cost to the materials, then you get into the material costing to also implement the eco-modularity. So if you compare between the two, activity-based costing, it offers a more accurate and fair cost distribution. It directly links the fees to the specific activities involved in the management of different materials. Whereas material differentiation may be less precise, but it's easier to apply. So that's how they compare between them. In terms of complexity, activity-based costing is more complex to implement. It requires detailed tracking of waste management activities. Of course, if you have organized collection of packaging under the control of the PRO, you have access to all this information. Of course, there are cases where municipalities get involved and you might have limited access to information. But if it's If it's an operation that the PRO is actually managing operationally, it has access to this information. On the other hand, material differentiation is simply relying on general material categories. In terms of incentivization, both methods can incentivize eco-friendly practices, but activity-based costing may better reflect the true cost of handling specific materials, encouraging more precise improvement in packaging design. But as I said, at the end of the day, we are using a mixture of both to have cost-based fees, but also adjusted for eco-modulation at the end of the day. Next slide. There is no next slide. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to address them.
Cool. Thanks, Kyriakos, for that insightful presentation. We will have Q&A after our panel discussion, which we have up next. So for now, we'll move on to the panel discussion, the topic of which will be the impact of design on the value chain. Our panel today consists of the previous speakers, Kyriakos and Boipelo, and they will be joined by Chandru Wadhwani and Lisa Steenkamp. Chandru, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is the Joint Managing Director of Extrapet and Propet, and Lisa is the Director of Westworld Recycling, which is a large buyback center located in Roodepoort, Johannesburg. Now I'm going to start off with 1 or 2 questions for each panelist, and we'll then leave it open for Q&A from the audience. And we've prepared a few questions, and I'll start with one for Kyriakos, if I can pose the first question to you. Having heard, the context of South Africa and, understanding a bit yourself before this, is eco-modulation possible in South Africa? And what would be some of the key findings that would need to be in place for it to be successful? As you mentioned, in an environment where you have material PROs, competing PROs, but you've even got PROs with differing models where some see the manufacturer or the converter as the producer.
Well, I don't want to say that it's impossible, but I have to say that I think it's very challenging. It will be very challenging, especially, as I was saying, if you think about eco-modulating between different materials that are in different PROs, in which case you need to change your pricing for certain materials by shifting cost between one material and the other. I don't know in the current context, how can material PROs decide, for example, one to give cost to another and the other to accept the cost in order to have a higher fee. That's why I believe that in order to get to that point, you need a superstructure that actually sets guidelines and communicates with the different PROs on what needs to be, how things need to be arranged between them so that they can eco-modulate the fees. And as I said in the presentation, I think that eventually there should be a superstructure that will work like a super PRO like CONAI in Italy, where we'll set up the fees and agree the transfer between the PROs.
Cool. Thanks for that. Interesting feedback. Thanks, Kyriakos. Just a follow-up on that, specifically speaking to the different models in South Africa where, you've got some that levy the fee at kind of the brand owner level and others that levy it but further down the value chain where it's more at the manufacturer level. So it's an added layer of complexity. How could one roll out eco-modulation in such a setup?
Well, definitely it's also more complicated when you have different stakeholders in the supply chain taking responsibility or a share of responsibility. I think once the way the cost is shared between the different stakeholders, let's say the converter takes 30% of the cost and the producer, the filler, takes 70% of the cost, whatever is the arrangement, I think you should keep that arrangement as well after you eco-modulate the fees. So once you decide, for example, that a certain material will have a lower or a higher fee because of eco-modulation, I think it should be reflected also in the way cost is shared. Of course, with eco-modulation, in reality, you need to give that incentive to the stakeholder in the supply chain that has control over the material, control over the packaging. So who decides about the design of the packaging? If it's the filler that makes all the decisions about the packaging, you need to give the incentive to the company that has control. That is why, although we do have examples in other countries, in Italy, for instance, where we have a shared responsibility, in most of the European countries, there is no shared responsibility. There are, of course, responsibilities in the supply chain, but cost-wise, EPR fee-wise, the EPR fee is applied on the filler or the importer of the packed product. For simplicity, for directing the fee to the company that has maximum control on the design of the package, and is usually the filler. Of course, you already have a shared responsibility scheme. I think one way to allocate, as I said, is based on how you allocate the fees today. Another way to do it is to devise another kind of allocation for the eco-modulated part of the fee, depending on who has control on the packaging, because that's the essence of it. You need to give the bonus or the penalty to the company that actually can affect the design of the packaging or the product.
Okay, thanks, Kyriakos. Makes sense. So the incentive goes to the decision maker, and that's where essentially the fee should be charged. Moving on to Chandru. Chandru, you are well placed to kind of help us understand this concept of the true costs of recycling. On your side, what are some of the challenges or costs that are currently unaccounted for? And then on the flip side, as a recycler, what would you say are some of the benefits that recyclers can enjoy if producers start designing products with recyclability in mind?
Morning, Junaid. Morning, everybody. Thank you.
Morning.
That's quite a deep question. I think in terms of hidden cost, and common to many recyclers globally of PET, one of the things is the issue around lightweighting. I don't think we fully appreciated or costed the impact of lightweighting on collection costs. We're definitely seeing challenges at recycling levels in terms of yields coming down because the bottle thicknesses are so thin now that you're losing a lot in the process. So I think that's kind of one of the hidden ones that needs a deeper dive. And really what we should not be doing is encouraging more lightweighting, but that's a very difficult conversation to have these days, as brand owners are trying to reduce their usage of plastics overall. But I think it's important somehow someone does calculations, and it won't be the same for every country. Every territory will be different. We have to be mindful of that as well, because collection systems are different, recycling infrastructures are different. But by way of opportunity, it's a very pertinent question today, because we have, in the space of the last 6 months, seen an incredible escalation in feedstock prices. The irony, at least from a South African context, is the more we pay, the worse the quality seems to get. And in that mix are then very poorly designed bottles. And it's sadly the usual suspects. It's the pigmented bottles. It's paper labels on PET bottles that still seem to be there, despite years of trying to appeal and encourage brand owners to move away from it. The new troublemakers, which I think were partly covered before, are the deep pigments, the opaque bottles. The reality is those bottles are all designed to go back to landfill, but from a costing standpoint, as a recycler, you've paid for it. It's part of your base cost, and now impacts on that model that Cherie alluded to in terms of the gap that a recycler needs to fill one way or the other. And especially if you have very high feedstock prices, then that gap just keeps on increasing. Obviously, the introduction of biodegradable is not helping at all. I think it's being sold on a false promise. I don't think it's sustainable. I think it's being sold at a more expensive cost, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think it does what it says, but it adds complexity to a PET recycler. You can't afford for those bottles to come in. So really having brand owners make changes, not just to design, but implementation of certain material streams, and not using some, would be highly beneficial to the whole value chain, at the end of the day. So I hope that's addressed the question, Junaid.
Sure. Yes, it does. Thanks. Thanks, Chandra, for that response. I'm going to then move on to our next panelist. And Lisa, I've got a similar question to you that I posed to Chandru. And that is, as a buyback center, what are some of the costs associated with badly designed packaging to your businesses? How does it affect you essentially? And what would be some of the benefits to your business of better designed packaging?
Morning, everybody. Junaid, I think as Bopela answered a little earlier, she referred to some lookalike PET bottles or PVC bottles, and that when it comes through, it increases the labor and the manual labor side of things, and the bigger quantities can be sorted. They also have a higher value if it's a nice clean PET bottle. But the smaller quantities of these jazz bottles or a lookalike bottle just results in productivity coming down, and just labor, really intensive labor to manually sort everything. And then obviously that also will leave us with a lot of discarding of those packages as well. And that more or less lands up in a landfill, because there's no outlet that really wants the lower grade bottles. So that's one of the bigger problems I'm facing in current weeks.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Lisa. So it looks like it's, again, there's inefficiencies that are, and additional costs that are caused by these badly designed packaging. Thanks for sharing that. And then I'll move on to Boipelo. The question for you this morning is, what role can PR, we've heard about, the impacts of badly designed packaging. So what role can a PRO play in encouraging better packaging design choices, and what is Petco currently doing in this space at the moment?
Thanks, Junaid. So I think what we're currently doing in this space at the moment is, Petco has packaging design guidelines, and they pretty much provide guidance on how to design PET packaging. And we'll soon actually also be launching an updated guideline that also offers design guidance for liquid board packaging. These are on our website and readily available and free for anyone to use. And I think more importantly, we have direct access to our members who are brand owners and producers. And so we do a lot of work where we engage with our members, especially if we know of members who are putting poorly designed packaging on the market. We engage with them, and we really try to support them and encourage them to transition their packaging to more, to better designed packaging. I think one of the challenges we have come across is that, members always say it can't be done at a flip of a switch. So we acknowledge that it's difficult, but we always try to sort of support our members and push them in the right direction. But I think in addition to that, so we do these immersion site visits for our members, where we actually take our members out of their offices and we show them the impact of the packaging they're putting on the market. So maybe take them to buyback centers, recycling facilities, or even landfill sites, so that they can actually really truly see and experience what their packaging does to recyclers, buyback centers, as well as the environment in terms of landfill sites. And so I think that impact is really important. And we've also embarked on an exciting project at Petco. We've just wrapped up the development of a recyclability certification that we hope to roll out soon. So I think all that work combined really does, as a PRO, it really does help to encourage better packaging design choices. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that, Boipelo. I'm going to open up for Q&A from the audience now. I've got one more question that has come through to me for Kyriakos, and that is, if I can raise it with you, do you think, Kyriakos, can you touch on the criteria and functions for a clearinghouse in an EPR system?
Yeah, well, as I said, there is already now, since 2018, an obligation for member states to set up a clearinghouse when there are multiple PROs. So the main function of the PRO is of the clearinghouse is to make sure that the competition between the PROs is controlled in a way that is not negatively impacting the actual recycling in the country. It's been observed over the years that if there is competing PROs, there is always cherry picking between the easy material to recycle and less incentive to look at and address the more difficult materials. There is always an incentive to work with commercial and industrial packaging that has a much lower cost rather than collecting and recycling household packaging, which has, in most of the cases, up to 10 times higher cost than commercial industrial packaging. And that can affect the implementation of infrastructure in the country and the funding of the significant funding gaps for the household packaging. So in reality, the clearinghouse needs to definitely allocate the responsibility between the PROs based on their market share. It needs to also observe that each PRO is actually investing also for household packaging, not only commercial industrial packaging, meeting their recycling targets, contributing to infrastructure, working together for communication strategies in order to avoid confusing people. And of course, in cases like Germany, where in the opening up of the market, because Germany originally had a single PRO, and then it decided to open the market to multiple PROs. So there are now 11 PROs. But between 2009 and 2019, the market actually collapsed, and the recycling rates of Germany were going down. They had a huge free riding problem because companies were hiding between the PROs. So the industry itself created a clearinghouse that was then endorsed by the ministry, which actually manages many competition issues between the PROs. So they have actually divided the country in 11 areas and each PRO has a primary responsibility in one area and secondary responsibility in the other area. So clearinghouse manages competition between the PROs because that competition can actually create a lot of issues in the deployment of recycling solutions in the country. And of course, for eco-modulation, it will set the guidelines and it will monitor that the guidelines are implemented by all the PROs in a consistent way.
Wow. Okay. No, thanks for that answer. I'll open up now to the audience for any questions. If you've got a question, feel free to raise your hand and Matt will unmute your mic and you can ask your question, or you can even leave it in the chat. There is a couple of questions in the chat. There's none yet coming from the audience. It's a question from Patricia Schroeder who's asking, it's probably best aimed at Kyriakos. Please confirm that eco-modulation should apply to the product only, example, design, treatment, recycling, etc., and not other PRO activities and costs such as admin costs, etc.
Well, the eco-modulation applies on the fee. So basically, you calculate the fees depending on the method you use to calculate the actual fees, and then you transfer cost between materials to eco-modulate the fees. So once your admin cost or communication cost is allocated between materials in order to have your material-specific fees, it means that eco-modulation is a transfer of cost between the total cost between one material and the other. So,
okay. It's material specific. And then Chandru, question on my side while we give the audience another chance to think about some questions. What would you expect the impact of eco-modulation essentially to be on your feedstock, and then on the other side, like the availability of recycled content for the sector itself?
I see two impacts, Junaid. One is we've got to recognize there's a lot of bottles that don't get collected because the commercials don't make sense. So eco-modulation is, I imagine, to recalibrate those markets where it would make sense. So you would see more colored bottles, for example, being collected than currently are. The other benefit would obviously be for those products like opaque or PET, PVC shrink sleeve, where the eco-modulation fees are high. You're kind of incentivizing a move away from design of bottles to those that are more favorable. So I think eco-modulation has a very positive role to play in terms of ensuring that we increase collection levels and recycling levels.
Again, are there any questions from the floor for our panelists or any of the speakers?
So, Junaid, if I may, I see there was one in the Q&A referring to EU legislation. If you're okay, I'll tackle that one. And I think that also was from Natasha, is SA ready to comply with international, especially Europe, regards to recyclable plastic standards required by food packaging content in Europe? Absolutely. We've already started the engagement over a year ago. A lot of this is centered around new regulations on EFSA. Over and above that, there are issues now on traceability. A lot of claims being made by brand owners are being challenged in terms of percentage contents, and is it actually post-consumer versus post-industrial? So recently, in the case of Extrapet, we've got our first Resi-class approval audited done. We're now looking at the other modules to add, and a lot of that also is to gear us up for international markets like Europe. But if she would like any more details, happy to take it offline and discuss it with her. Thank you.
Thanks, Chandra. Just checking if there are any more questions from the floor. We still do have a bit of time for questions, so any more? Perhaps I can also table another one at Boipelo. Boipelo, from a PRO perspective, what types of data, evidence, protocols, or general information would you think would be needed for a PRO to successfully implement eco-modulation?
I think that we would definitely need more detailed information on the products that our members put on the market. So more detailed information on the actual design of those products. And then obviously, I think the bale characterizations are really great and a great way of tracking, what packaging is out there, what problematic packaging is coming through our PET bales. But then I think that what's also really important maybe is to start quantifying the costs that Lisa and Chandru spoke about, the true cost that the recyclers actually have to pay for dealing with this kind of packaging. So I think starting to quantify it would be important to feed into the implementation of eco-modulation.
Okay, cool. Thanks for those points. And then are there any further questions? There's one more in the chat here, I see. We've not answered, which is, I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this one. The question is, how will this increase the amount paid to waste pickers on the ground doing the work, collecting the materials? So speaking about the introduction of eco-modulation and how that essentially would affect what waste pickers earn on the ground.
If I may, what that will do is allow us then to demand more. Let's take the example of green bottles. There's far more green bottles out there than the recyclers can collect. If now there's a better incentive to recycle those bottles, that would feed through into the purchase price that we would offer to collect. And again, remember, a lot of the time, the volume you're seeking is determined by the price that you're paying. But if you don't have that demand, then sadly, the reality is the price for those products are going to be low. And the case in point that Lisa touched on, if you take a PVC bottle today, it has a zero value. I don't know if you could possibly ever put an eco-modulation on that, for example, but you could certainly incentivize a better price for waste pickers if eco-modulation was applied on stuff like green and amber bottles.
If you allow me, Junaid, just to add to that, the funding of the difficult material should come from the targets and the increasing targets over the years. So that will oblige the PROs to deal with difficult material, which means that it will oblige them to collect sufficient funding from the producers to actually manage those materials. Actually, eco-modulation goes the other way around. So we shouldn't expect eco-modulation to incentivize the difficult material. It's the other way around. Eco-modulation transfers costs from the easy material to the difficult material to give an incentive to improve the design. So the actual funding of the difficult material should come from the targets and the obligations of the PRO to collect all the types of packaging with increased recycling targets every year so that they will go out there and collect sufficient funding to do it. So we shouldn't expect eco-modulation to work on the difficult materials. It's actually the other way around.
Cool. Thanks for that clarity, Kyriakos. I'm noting the time here. We've got 5 minutes left, and we've already heard some good themes coming out about increasing efficiencies within the value chain through eco-modulation, increasing the general value within the value chain that all would enjoy throughout. So I'm going to allow the panelists one last parting comment each, and then after that we can wrap up. So shall we do the rounds? We can start with yourself, Kyriakos, and then make our rounds through the panel.
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest challenges I saw in the regulations back then when they came out was actually, and puzzling even my mind, how could you do it with material PROs and eco-modulate, besides the materials, for example, different plastic chemistries that might be in the same PRO, so that PRO can actually shift cost from one chemistry to the other. I think it's very challenging, and when I was discussing also with some of the members of the Alliance, I was ringing a bell that the Alliance should develop into a superstructure, a super PRO to deal with these kind of issues, even in the absence of a clearinghouse, because that's an issue for the authorities to take care of. So I would urge the industry to rethink on how things operate and how you can deal with things like eco-modulation in the existing ecosystem without making significant changes. I think there should be some kind of coordination between the PROs, and that could come from the Alliance if the Alliance becomes a super structure for PRO. Wow. So some of the decisions will be made at that level, not at the PRO level.
Yeah, so it's almost leveraging some of that clearinghouse responsibility at a super alliance level, as you say. Okay.
Which is the case anyways. Even if you have a clearinghouse, you need coordination. But in the absence of that coordination, it's even more important to make sure that you have a mechanism between the PROs to discuss and decide how to deal with this kind of issue.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kyriakos. Chandru, any parting words from your side?
Firstly, thank you. Always appreciate these opportunities. And where possible, invite brand owners to come visit recyclers and see it for themselves. Partly want to respond on Kyriakos's point respectfully. The reality is in some parts of the world, I mean, the ideal is we use eco-modulation to move everybody to a clear and light blue bottle. We know that's going to be very difficult. The reality is how do you then deal with those like green and amber? I think eco-modulation has a role to play because there are products that can be made from green and light brown, not as much as we have on the clear side, but that's where eco-modulation can really provide a key role for certain parts of the world more than others. But yes, in an ideal world, if we can move everyone through eco-modulation to design everything clear or light blue, then that's first prize. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Sure. Thank you, Chandra. And then I've got notice, unfortunately, from Lisa that she's a bit ill, so she won't be entertaining any more questions. But Boipelo, last comment from your side, or anyone else on the Petco team.
Thanks, Junaid. I think the last comment on my side is that I guess until we reach a point where we can actually implement eco-modulation, I think it's really important for PROs to translate all the things that we see on the ground, to translate that into communication to brand owners, to recyclers, collectors as well, so that we can at least start to get the ball rolling. It rolls very slowly, so I think it's really important to start doing the work and continue doing the work until such time we can implement eco-modulation. Thank you.
Thanks, Boipelo, and thanks to the panelists. So that brings us to the end of the webinar this morning. I'm sure that you guys will agree the session has already been really useful in understanding eco-modulation and definitely the challenges on how we would apply that in South Africa and how far we've got to go in that regard. As Petco, we continue to strive to bring these and other topics like this for discussion to our members and the broader sector to inform the rollout of EPR in South Africa. In closing, just before you jump off the call, I'll ask you to take a few seconds to just complete a poll that will pop up on your screens now. For the poll, there's a rating of 1, which refers to your unlikely or lower value, and then the rating of 5, which refers to most likely and a higher value. And this is just feedback for us on this webinar, which will be used to inform future webinars going forward. I thank all our speakers and panelists today for their contributions, as well as the audience for spending the morning with us. We look forward to further discussions around this important topic. With that, it's time for us to say goodbye. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you all for attending.